Hello everyone.
Good morning.
So I'm just gonna double check that you can all see and hear me. I have to turn my own volume up actually here. Excellent. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Boy, the Zoom interface has changed a little bit with this latest update. Um, it's a little strange actually. I don't have any online classes this term, and so this just feels a little strange. Although I do think well, obviously, I think moving the class online was the wiser choice, given the weather. It's not too bad here just yet as I look out the window, but I can see that they've done the preemptive salting of the streets and sidewalks and so forth. And when I look at the weather map, it looks like the freezing rain is due to start any minute. So, um, yeah, definitely wouldn't want to be outside. So through the rest of the day, I hope you all take care. But for now, what I want to do is just as quickly as possible, run through the rest of the material on narrative theories of self. And then we're going to begin Parfit's chapter. I will also, well, I am recording this lecture too. So for those that are not able to be here live, I will place the recording or upload the recording to my YouTube channel, um, so that people who aren't here can watch it later. So prior to the second quiz, we were talking about narrative theories of self, and we learned that there are these hermeneutical narrative theories that see life as this quest for the good. There's Dennett's view, where the self is sort of like a center of narrative gravity. There's Sheckman's own view, the narrative self-constitution view, which is a sort of middle ground between the two. And a lot of the commonalities and differences that we're going to talk about here, I think I've already sort of intimated at. So hopefully it won't take us too long to get through everything. Yeah, that's right. The time change. I woke up thinking, well, maybe this weather is a little bit of a blessing. Um, because as you all know, I'm certainly not a morning person. And it's nice, not firstly not to have to worry about being on the streets right now, but also to have gotten to sleep in a tiny bit. This won't be the case for Friday though, but that's okay because we'll be in the thick of it with Parfit's chapter, and that's a fun chapter. So, yeah, commonalities and differences. Well, one of the things I sort of gestured at previously was that on the narrative approaches, on most of them anyway, um, uh, on the well, maybe I shouldn't even say on most of them, but on the hermeneutical ones, McIntyre, Taylor, etc. Um, the lives of selves are such that naturalistic or reductionist explanations are not really sufficient um, to give an account of um, selves, of persons as selves. I mean, we could do this if we simply wanted to describe ourselves as creatures, right? Um, but um, on the hermeneutical views, we need ways to describe ourselves, um, our roles within the stories that are our lives, um, that take us beyond merely biological or mechanistic accounts, right? We need to account for ourselves in a way where our lives have meaning and significance. Now, this means different things to different people, um, but by and large, uh, you think of McIntyre or Taylor or Ricoeur. Uh, Life is this sort of narrative quest toward the good, a good life. Um, that's our sort of telos, right? We'll get to that on the next slide. So, um, yeah, the kind of significance we're talking about, if you're a hermeneutical theorist, is like almost like an existential significance or a spiritual significance. Dennett and Sheckman less so, right? At least on the theories that we've looked at from Dennett and Sheckman, as Sheckman herself characterizes them, there isn't this overarching further meaning to life. There are like lowercase m meanings, which might be particular to the kinds of things that we do. I'm hesitant to use the term a little bit more episodic, because Strawson is going to use that term episodic in quite a different way than I've just used it. Um, so, think of it as being more local, right? There are meanings, but no capital M overarching meaning to life. Um, but maybe this isn't a very worthwhile distinction. I mean, certainly, I don't think the hermeneutical theorists would think that we should accept this distinction between, lowercase m meaning and capital M meaning. Maybe they would say that, meaning in the lowercase m meaning depends upon meaning in a greater sense, like an ultimate purpose in life. Or maybe an ultimate purpose in life um, emerges from uh, how meaningful these more local episodes are, these parts of the narrative, which ones we adopt into our self-identity, might contribute to an individual's picture of meaning in the capital M meaning sense, right? So there could be some debate there. I'll skip the discussion point on the bottom here because I am trying to get through this reasonably quickly. I'll get myself out of the way. I can't quite read the end of the slide here. Um, let's talk about normativity, evaluation, and agency. So, Sheckman says that another theme found in almost all narrative views is that selfhood and the narratives that make us selves must involve some level of evaluation and normativity. And a related theme here is a theme of intelligibility. So, recall that our actions on these narrative views, especially the hermeneutical views, require an end or a telos. That's how we make sense of these intentional actions. Think back to McIntyre's example of gardening. How do we explain what our gardener is doing, right? Is he preparing food for the winter? Is he pleasing his wife? Is he taking some exercise? These are all ends, right? And they're how we make sense of what our gardener is doing. Uh, the aims are also normative. Uh, that's the way in which we make sense of ourselves. Um, that's the ways in which we make sense of ourselves involve evaluation and normativity. That is that we evaluate our little ends and characterize them in terms of oughts and ought nots. I ought to get out and garden more. It would be good for me, right? Or I ought not to garden. It's still wintertime. It would be pointless. I could do something else if I wanted to take some exercise or make my partner happy or something, right? And again, not to belabor the point, but on the hermeneutical views, your your overarching sort of capital T telos is that quest for the good or a quest for a meaningful life. But other views are normative in this way too. So if we think back to the example of Gilbert, um, on either Dennett's or Vellman's characterization of Gilbert, when the novel writing machine um, writes in its narrative that I am going into the closet now, it's almost as if the machine is giving our character Gilbert a reason to go into the closet. I'm going into the closet. He can do that, or perhaps the machine slash Gilbert can decide not to do it. Either way, it makes Gilbert, Sheckman says, an evaluator, a being who can view some courses of action as preferable to others in a principled way, long before any question of ethics or the good life is brought in. So, this provides some of that agency we talked about in the previous couple lectures too. Remember that agents are beings who act on the basis of reasons, and now our novel writing machine slash Gilbert has given itself a reason why it's doing what it's doing. So, evaluativeness and normativity are important on Sheckman's view. They're also important on some of the developmental views we talked about, like Nelson's. Um, Another interesting bit of commonalities and differences, embeddedness, embodiness, and interactions with others. I don't know if uh, because this class occurs so early in the morning, I cannot quite recall um, how detailed I've gotten with 4E cognition. But on 4E cognition, the short version is that cognition is not just something that happens within the bounds of the cranium, if you like. Um, Cognition is embodied, right? Cognizers are embodied creatures. So we have bodies. We're embedded in a dynamic physical environment. Our environment isn't static, things happen. And we have to deal with things that happen. So we're embedded in this kind of dynamic, almost chaotic environment. Um, Cognition is therefore extended through the body into the environment, and we can scaffold our cognition with the body, with the environment, with elements in the environment. Um, and cognition, especially, perception, which I suppose, depending on who you ask, is not all that cognitive, uh, is um, is an active process. We use the world as and activism is much less emphasis on things like mental representations. The idea is that we use the world as its own best model. And perception is a matter of active engagement with the world by taking advantage of our sensory motor contingencies, the ways that we can sense and move around within the world. And on the narrative views, in keeping with the first two E's, we are embodied beings and we are embedded in a world where we interact with other selves, among other things. So Sheckman explains. In the hermeneutical views, she writes, we see this feature in the stress put on the necessity of placing oneself in a tradition. There can be no more private meaning in the sense of requisite for selfhood, according to these theorists, than there can be a private language, according to Wittgenstein, and for many of the same reasons. So, meaning in the same way that Wittgenstein thought that you couldn't really have a private language because language is not that kind of a thing. Language is, a form of life. Um, it's a way that we um, It's one of the ways that we be. And I'm sorry to put it that way, but we exist in a world of other speakers, and the meanings of the words that we use um, are fixed by how we all use them. Um, Here, we're not talking about meaning in the linguistic sense, but meaning in this sort of existential or spiritual sense, in the normative sense, like in the evaluative sense. Um, so if you place yourself in some tradition or another, which could be a philosophy, um, it could be a religion, um, it could be a community of some kind, um, right? You place yourself within this sort of tradition and meaning arises, but it arises because we are embodied and embedded in the sense that we're socially situated kinds of beings. Now, Sheckman's narrative self-constitution view actually places a couple restraints or constraints upon our narratives, our self-constituting narratives. Remember, for her, we we kind of um, uh, we these narratives are what constitute selves for her, right? So she names the articulation constraint. Um, you have to have the capacity to articulate your narrative locally when appropriate, and there's a reality constraint as well, on which our narratives have to fit within the conception of reality, which is shared by a community. Um, so I'm socially situated, and I constitute myself, myself is constituted out of this sort of socially situated narrative, which means I have to have the capacity to articulate it locally when appropriate, which I don't know. I mean, like, think it could be as something as simple as explaining to myself why I'm getting up so early in the mornings, even though I'm not a morning person. Well, it's because I've got to teach a really interesting philosophy class with a bunch of really great students, right? And then there's the reality constraint. Our narratives have to fit within a shared conception of reality. Um, you know, think of one of the reasons why getting sucked into conspiracy theory of one kind or another can be isolating. You become a flat earther and all your friends and family think you're insane. So you end up placing yourself in a different community. You only hang out with the flat earthers, right? Because you don't have this shared conception of reality that the rest of us have. Could be one example. Nelson has a similar idea to Sheckman here. Nelson says narrative emerges from and belongs to the community. But in the individual lives of children, it is a vehicle through which consciousness of both the self and the wider social and temporal world becomes manifest and gradually emerges as a new subjective level of conscious awareness, with a sense of a specific past and awareness of a possible future, as well as with new insight into the consciousness of other people. That's a long sentence. Um, so, our ability, um, to conceive of ourselves in narrative terms, quite like Sheckman's narrative self-constitution view, is grounded in our social interactions with others. We learn um, how to situate ourselves within these narratives as we develop the possibilities for our own futures. We become aware of those. We use memories about the past uh, to constitute um, our identities. Think of the simple sort of storytelling ideas that we talked about last week. Not storytelling, but you ask a child, "What did you do today, kiddo?" "Oh, we went to see Daddy. It was fun." Right? Those are simple narratives, But as we grow and develop and get better and better at doing this, this is how we come to form our own identities. Ourselves are, again, like on Sheckman's view, um, constituted by these abilities to situate ourselves within our own sort of narrative. Um, One last thing I'll read you here from McIntyre. I think in agreement with Nelson and with Sheckman, we are never more, and sometimes less, than the co-authors of our own narratives. Only in fantasy do we live what story we please. And that's because um, of that we're embodied creatures embedded in this sort of dynamic, not just a physical environment, but a social environment. Now, how do we tell our narratives? After all, narratives are like stories, and usually we tell stories to an audience. So if the self is narrative in nature, is the story actually told? If it is told, to whom is it told? Well, hermeneutical theorists think that at least, at the very least, we've got to tell our story to ourselves. We don't necessarily have to do this explicitly, like, for example, by narrating our lives to ourselves. Um, it can happen implicitly, and we also enact our narratives. Our lives don't just happen to us. Well, I suppose they do to some people. But ideally, for the hermeneutical theorists, you're enacting your life. You are living your life, not just letting your life happen to us. Now, sometimes we tell these narratives to other people, but by and large, our narratives are enacted, um, and they are told, perhaps explicitly, but probably implicitly, to ourselves, if not to other people. For Dennett, our narratives are explicitly told through our actions and our words. Told to whom? Um, well, Dennett doesn't quite specify. Um, Neither does Velleman. But I suppose it's conceivable that, rather like the hermeneutical theorists, we sometimes implicitly or explicitly tell our narratives to ourselves. We certainly communicate them to other people. Let's not get hung up on that. For Nelson, on the developmental theories, narratives are explicitly told, um, but this could be an artifact of the kinds of studies that evolutionary and developmental psychologists do. Narratives are explicitly told, perhaps because they're prompted. We're asked to actually explicate something, right? For Sheckman, her narrative self-constitution view. Oh my goodness. Excuse me. Her narrative self-conscious constitution view requires that one be able to articulate one's narrative locally where appropriate, but sees narration as a largely implicit process that manifests itself mostly in the quality of our experience and the choices we make. Um, so largely implicit, sometimes explicit. All right. Those are the commonalities and differences. How are we doing so far? Any questions? I feel like there's so much less discussion now that I'm doing this online. But how are we doing so far with the material? I think we probably want to speed through the rest of it, right? Get to Parfit. You can let me know in the chat if you have any questions at any time.
It's making sense.
Oh, good. Thank you.
No problem.
So let's talk about Strawson. Um, he identifies two theses in the narrative view and rejects both of them. So Strawson is not a narrative theorist. In fact, he claims not to experience his own life this way. Um, he calls himself an episodic, which I find very interesting for reasons that I'll come back to in a moment. But the two theses he identifies and rejects are what he calls the psychological narrativity thesis. This is the thesis that ordinary humans experience their lives in narrative form. He absolutely rejects this. Again, he's an episodic, so he thinks that is incorrect. There's also the ethical narrativity thesis, which is the idea that it's essential to a well-lived life to experience your life in narrative form. And Strawson thinks this is pernicious. Okay, so he's an episodic. So he claims not to experience um, uh, himself and his life in narrative form, but rather as a series of episodes, right? I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm teaching the class. After this, I might make breakfast or have a nap, right? After that, I've got to do other things. There's a cat around here somewhere who's being shy. I'm going to take him to the vet, right? Um, okay. But I mean, episodes, I don't know. I just find the idea of an episode quite narrative. Um, and I gestured at this. Oh, hello. I gestured at this in class a little while ago. What do we call episodes of television series? Well, we call them episodes, and episodes are like slices, either of a sort of story arc, an overarching narrative, or they are little isolated, self-contained narratives. Some question in the chat here. Yes, I'm trying to get him to come over, Isabel. Yo, yo. Hey, buddy, come here. Oh, everybody's really excited about the cat. I have to warn you, he's a little high, because he is actually going to the vet later. So he's on some good stuff that will calm him down, so that he's not stressed out from being in the crate. Come on, buddy. There we go. Here we go. Yes, sir. He's a good boy. Class is very excited to meet you. Yeah, he's a big boy. Oh, now he's doing that. Very good boy. All right, sir. I'll carry on now. Now he's just going to sit by the computer, and if you see the screen moving like this, it's because he's just kind of oh no, I can't see. He's kind of bonking the screen. Uh Yeah, he is a little Cheeto Puff. So yeah, I don't think this fellow here has too many views about the self. Um, Although maybe in an implicit way, like, and I often wonder about this actually, when it comes to, I wonder things about non-human animals, like um, whether they whether they understand. Uh, Whether they have a sort of implicit notion of a self. I mean, they must in some sense. If I think that my cat understands the difference between himself as a subject and other objects. He certainly seems to know that I am not him because he comes and bothers me for food when he's hungry. He knows that there's a little catnip cat toy over there on the ground. I mean, he understands that that is an object that he can play with. Um, of course, I don't think there's any sort of overarching quest for the good, unless the good is laying in sunbeams and getting pets and stuff. But you know, it's funny. Like I've been watching this National Geographic program about whales, right? On on National Geographic. And it's a nature documentary, so they have to do some storytelling, right? So okay, this killer whale needs to teach her calf how to catch the seals on the beach, at least the narrator is putting it in, they're spinning a narrative. Whether the animals themselves are doing that is a question, an open question, right? And maybe it depends on the animal. Maybe you have to be cognitively sophisticated enough to do that sort of thing. In any case, um, so Strawson is going to draw a distinction here between one's experience of oneself when one is considering oneself principally as a human being taken as a whole, and one's experience of oneself when one is considering oneself principally as an inner mental entity or self of some sort. So you have your sort of whole self that you can think of um, as a human being taken as a whole. And then there's your experienced self, an inner mental self. So the former is I, me, self, and the latter is I star, me star, self star. And Strawson thinks his experienced self, the self star, is episodic in nature. He says, I'm well aware that my past is mine insofar as I am a human being. So I have a past that is mine, but I star doesn't experience their self in this sort of architectonic way, right? So I can experience. I'm aware that my past is mine insofar that I'm a human being, and I fully accept that there is a sense in which it has special relevance to me, the inner self. Now, at the same time, I have no sense that I, the experienced self, was there in the past, and I think it is obvious that I, the inner mental self, was not there as a matter of metaphysical fact. I suppose I see what he's saying. There's an I, an experienced self that I'm experiencing right now, but that is the I of this particular moment in time. There's a me with no star who is the same me that I was yesterday, but there's also the me star now who is not the me star that I was yesterday. I mean, think of rivers. Go back to Perry's dialogue on the self and some of Gretchen and Sam and Dave's conversations about the nature of selves, and they use the rivers as an example. Might help you make further sense of this. But Strawson does introduce some problems for the narrative views. This is how Schechtman describes them. Much of Strawson's account of his episodic nature is a denial that his self has any overall theme or moral unity of the sort required by the hermeneutical view. Since this analysis does not apply to all versions of the narrative view, it is most useful to think of Strawson's challenge as presenting a dilemma for narrative theorists. The dilemma is roughly this. Either narrative views are too demanding to be plausible, or they are not narrative in any interesting sense. That is, either the narrative view really demands that our lives and self-understandings are like literature in some strong sense, or it does not. In Strawson's own words, If someone says, as some do, that making coffee is a narrative that involves narrativity because you have to think ahead, do things in the right order, and so on, and that everyday life involves many such narratives, then I take it the claim is trivial. So maybe our lives are narrative in structure, but who cares? They're like trivial narratives. Like, okay, I'm going to make coffee now. I'll put the kettle on. I'll get my I'll grind my beans. Um, warm up the coffee mug. Warm up the French press. Um, someone asked me what I'm doing. What are you doing there? Oh, I'm making coffee. That's a narrative, but it's trivial that it's a narrative. It's like, okay, who cares? That's not like a narrative in literature, right? I'm not Frodo casting the ring into the cracks of doom here. I'm just making a cup of coffee. So it's rather trivial. Um, Maybe hermeneutical theorists could reply by saying that this episodic self is still narrative and that still matters. Maybe it's just the local narratives are trivial. But remember, it's that overarching narrative um, that matters. Um, that's where we derive meaning and significance from. Maybe they could also argue that an episodic self can still have ethical concerns. I'm going to put that question aside, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page um, regarding what the episodic self is before we finish. We've only got a couple more slides, so how are we doing so far? Let's see in the chat. Very good. Okay. So are the cells really are these narratives really trivial? Rudd says the understanding of even simple human actions must take a narrative form is, I would suggest, by no means a trivial point, given the continuing influence of rival scientific models of action explanation. So it's not trivial that something as simple as my making coffee can be given a sort of narrative explanation because narrative explanations are agentive explanations, or at least they can be. And agentive explanations do something that um, scientific or naturalistic models of action explanation don't. That is, um, they allow for agency. I mean, my making coffee, I suppose you could understand in terms of just brain activity, if you wanted to. But I think to really make sense of that sort of behavior, you need to give an agentive explanation, an explanation where I can explain the reasons. I could give you the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's not just that those neural bits and pieces in the brain, it's not just that my synapses are craving those caffeine molecules or something, right? It's because it's the morning and I always have coffee in the morning. That's part of my personality. Uh, I'm sleepy, so I need some of that caffeine. I believe that I can alleviate my sleepiness by making a nice cup of coffee and drinking it, right? Agentive explanations. These are not trivial um, because they give us something that the naturalist or reductionist accounts don't. Maybe we're talking past each other here too, right? Like maybe Strawson and the narrative theorists actually disagree about what selves are. So Strawson focuses a lot on subjectivity, like selves experienced as such. But he doesn't really talk too much about agency, embodiedness, and embeddedness. But that's something that the narrative theorists are quite interested in. Similar concern emerges is in Dan Zahavi's um, work. So Sheckman writes, this concern also emerges in Dan Zahavi's complaint that narrative theories are incomplete because they fail to recognize a core component of selfhood, namely the fundamental given mindness that is part of the structure of all experience. Phenomenologists would call this the primitive self, right? Um, Narrative theorists, Zahavi says, have part of the picture worked out, but they don't explain the mindness of experience. What I mean by that, and what I think these folks mean by that, is that I experience my experiences. I don't just have these experiences, I experience them as my own from a point of view, right? So selves are, or a self is for Zahavi, quote, a self-conscious entity that is the kind of thing that might care about the nature of its life and interactions, and the narrative comes in after the self already exists. And I think that's a pretty good point. After all, at least as we've looked at them. Ow. Sorry, he's attacking me. Um, ow. Uh, yeah, ow. Well, there we go. My cat is a little ornery and so he grabs me a little too hard sometimes. Um, and I experience that as mine, right? There's a given mineness to that sort of the feeling of being chomped on by this little guy. Um, So that's the best way I can think of to explain that. Also, it's distracting when you get a cat chomping on you. He's not a mean cat. Sorry, forgive the digression. Um, oh, are you leaving, sir? Okay, farewell. Um, yeah, so around this time last year, I found out it might be, or it might just be, as we'll see, we might just offer a reductionist explanation. Yeah, around this time last year, maybe a little bit later, in April, I think it was. Anyway, I found out that Yo-Yo, that's his name, has hyperthyroidism. So he has a like a little tumor which causes the thyroid gland to like overproduce hormones. So basically it ramps up everything, right? So one of the things that can happen with hyperthyroid cats is they can be like kind of grumpy and kind of like not hyperactive, but you know, it makes them like shift into high gear, as it were, right? So that's why he's going to the vet because he gets regular tests so that we can keep his levels under control. And he's due for one of these tests. And one of the reasons is, well, it's not just time. I've also noticed him becoming a bit more chompy. So, that's when I know, okay, time to take him and see to see what the levels are like and adjust the medication. So notice that, like, the explanation of Yo-Yo's behavior is kind of reductionist, but the explanation of what I'm doing there is narrative in form. Um, Interesting. So using my cat for an example. I hope the weather doesn't get any worse than this, actually, because yeah, that is one place I still have to go today. Um, Lamarck and the literary narrative. Um, Narrative theories draw this analogy between life and literature. But in doing so, they mislead us about the nature of both. And again, I did sort of gesture at all of this stuff before, right? Um, in literature, the details of the presentation matter, right? You've got symbolism, imagery, different narrative devices, literary devices. And so Lamarck says, the more we try to restore the distinctively literary features of canonical literary narratives, the more remote they become from real life. Indeed, a stronger point can be made. To the extent that literary features are brought to bear on real life narratives, they have a distorting and pernicious effect on self understanding that such narratives are supposed to yield. Um, and just compare like what a literary critic does with literature, and like the way she analyzes a piece of literature versus the way we understand our own lives. Um, there are differences there. And two mistakes that we make um, are firstly that we suppose that literary works are simply stories about people like you and me, a species of real life narratives. Of course, that's sometimes true. Well, it's true in one sense, in which it's true in the sense in which you can have literary narratives about more or less ordinary people, but they're still not like us in certain important ways. Another mistake is to suppose that our own life narratives are mini works of literature, complying with the principles of literary appreciation. This is a mistake because it invokes a false image of ourselves as kinds of fictional characters whose identity rests on narrative description and whose actions are explicable in functional, teleological, or thematic ways. Although I don't know. Um, Dennett would say, sure, you're right about the teleological stuff, but not about the fictionality of our narratives. Yeah, sure, selves, narratives, they're all fictions. They're centers of narrative gravity. Then again, Lamarck is aiming these concerns mostly at the hermeneutical theorists. How would they respond? Well, McIntyre would say life and literature are kind of similar in structure, but there are important differences that he wouldn't want to deny. Rickwer says that some of the difficulties Lamarck is pointing to, quote, do not seem to me to be such as to abolish the very option of the appreciation of fiction to life, or the application of fiction to life. The objections are valid only in opposition to a naive conception of mimesis. So mimesis, an ancient Greek word. Plato talks about mimesis a lot. Mimesis is what artists do. Mimesis is the root of a lot of different English words, just to give you a sense of its meaning. Whoops. It's mimesis, for example, is cognate with memory, with meme, with mime, um, right? So a sort of representation, if you like. Fiction is fictional narratives are kind of mimesis, and our lives are not. Further, these objections are less to be refuted than to be incorporated in a more subtle, more dialectical comprehension of appropriation. So maybe there are some differences, but that's fine. That's not a problem if we make our theory accommodate this stuff. Sheckman identifies a number of different roles with respect to narrative. There are characters, authors, and critics or readers. Um, Perhaps we are, real life narratives have more character and author, less critic reader. Although I don't know. Lamarck is most concerned with the differences in any case between life and literature from the perspective of the critic and the reader. Um, our lives, I suppose, aren't read to other people. Although I don't know, this is debatable. I see this is very debatable. But Lamarck sees narrative theorists as arguing that we should take this perspective within our own lives when we cannot. We can only take the character's perspective. I don't know about that. I think we can also take an authoritative perspective. Again, hermeneutical theories emphasize agency. So, in the sense that I'm an agent, I'm also a little bit of an author and perhaps a little bit of a reader and a critic. You know, if I'm living an examined life, that is. So, anyway, that's it for narrative views. Any questions? So next is the unimportance of identity, which is one of the longer chapters. But I think perhaps one of the more straightforward chapters. Uh, it's straightforward in the sense that, Parfit's writing is punchy. Anyone notice that? It's very punchy. Like this. He says this, then he says that, then he says this, then he says that. Very punchy. It's clear and straightforward in that sense. Although, you know what he deals with, um, the idea that personal identity is not what matters, is a little counterintuitive. Of course, it's an idea that we have encountered. Think of chapter 3 in Perry's dialogue when Sam and Dave are trying to convince Gretchen to undergo this medical procedure. The one inspired by Who is Julia? So Gretchen's worried that if she doesn't have the same body, she'll no longer be her. And Dave is like, well, okay, who cares? Like, there's going to be somebody who wakes up tomorrow. That somebody is going to think that they're you. They're going to have your memories, your beliefs and desires, your personality traits. Um, Someone is going to be there that's going to be psychologically continuous with you in the right kinds of ways. Who cares if it's you or not? If it's identical, if that future person is identical with you. That's not what matters. What matters is there's going to be somebody who's there. Um, and that's kind of where the dialogue ends, because that's when Gretchen passes away, right? Dave, it's too late. Ah, so that's what we're looking at today. Um, Reminds me a lot of the discussion that took place on the third night in Perry's dialogue on the self. We'll begin with a thought experiment, or what Parfit likes to call a science fiction case. So, the teletransporter. Here on Earth, I enter the teletransporter. When I press some button, a machine destroys my body while recording the exact states of all my cells. The information is sent by radio to Mars, where another machine makes, out of organic materials, a perfect copy of my body. The person who wakes up on Mars seems to remember living my life up to the moment when I press the button, and he is in every other way just like me. So pretty much, kind of similar to the transporter device from Star Trek, right? Although interestingly, Parfit claims never to have watched Star Trek, which I think is really interesting because the teletransporter, I mean, it's something they do fun stuff with the transporter on Star Trek, right? That all relates to questions around identity, right? I'll talk about that in a moment. Of those who have thought about cases like this, to paraphrase. Some believe that you would be waking up on Mars. Um, Teletransportation would just be the fastest way of traveling, right? Traveling at the speed of light to Mars. Of course, it would still take a while to get there. There'd be a delay. You wouldn't instantly be there, but you'd be there much sooner than you would if you were taking a spaceship. Others believe that if I chose to be teletransported, I might be making a mistake. Those people that think I'm making a mistake might say that, well, what's happening is that it's a mere replica of you on Mars. The real you was killed when the machine destroyed your body. Oh, Dale, yeah. I um I don't know if because I'm not one of the organizers. I'm just spreading the word. Um I don't know. You might have to email Cups, somebody in Cups. I hope it still happens if it's safe to hold it in person. I'm actually awaiting an update. I haven't heard anything yet. But that particular episode does not involve the transporter. Yeah, Jack Reagan, who was a student in this course a couple of years ago. Um, very into Star Trek, like myself. Very interested in personal identity and the self, like myself. And he's going to use The Inner Light, an episode of The Next Generation, which is, oh, it's such a good episode. If you're going to this event, you should watch that episode if you can beforehand. But of course, there's all kinds of transporter hijinks on Star Trek, right? There's I think the episode is entitled The Evil Within. That's from the original series. Transporter accidentally makes two copies of Captain Kirk and one is good. But he's like super passive and can't do anything, and one is like evil and active, and so there's like a good Kirk and an evil Kirk. So kind of fun. Real good old-timey cheesy sci-fi, right? Um, there's Second Chances, Next Generation, where the Enterprise encounters a transporter duplicate of Commander Riker, who's been stuck on this planet for years and years. So, Riker, he beams up and, he thinks he's made it back to the ship, but then there's another of him that thinks he didn't make it back, and then he is eventually found and rescued. The funny thing about that episode is that the two Rikers just absolutely hate each other, which I think is just it's really funny. It's an episode that's not really like about the metaphysics of identity, but more like deals with questions of personality. Like you might think like, oh, I like the person I am, but then if you had to like interact with yourself, you might hate yourself. It's kind of like that. And then there's Tuvix from Voyager, which is just insane. Neelix and Tuvok are getting transported, and what is there some kind of dumb flower that does some science fiction stuff, and now Tuvok and Neelix are Tuvix. They're one person, and so what do we do with Tuvix? Do we let him exist? So like Neelix and Tuvok are dead, or do we kill Tuvix and separate Neelix and Tuvok? Well, spoiler alert: Captain Janeway, just let's kill Tuvix. And Tuvix begs for his life in that episode. Nope, sorry, Tuvix. We need our regular characters back. So they figure some way to beam them apart, so that we get Neelix and Tuvok back. But that's basically killing Tuvix. I know I'm laughing, but it's not a funny episode. It's like kind of dark at the end. Uh, you should watch it and come back to me and see what you think, or let me know what you think. Okay. We're not dealing with anything so extreme, but the question is, would the person who arrives on Mars be me? Spoiler alert, Parfit is going to say, not in so many words, that doesn't matter. This is not what matters. Whether the person who rematerializes on Mars is identical with the person who dematerialized on Earth is just not what is important in a case like this. Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Dale. Yeah, so that's the enemy within. So season, oh, I didn't realize it was that early of an episode. Just the fifth episode of the first season. Yeah. But yeah, the second chances episode of TNG is well into the sixth season, which is the penultimate season of Next Generation. I forget Tuvik's, but it was an early one. It was an early one on Voyager. So, am I the same person or not when I rematerialize on Mars? This is a disagreement about identity. And there are two kinds of identity. There's qualitative identity and numerical identity. We're interested in numerical identity. Remember the box of Kleenex from John Perry's dialogue? You know, look at that box of Kleenex over there. Say I destroy it and then it reappears. Well, it might be qualitatively identical. The Kleenex box that reappears might be qualitatively identical in terms of its qualities with the first Kleenex box, but it's not numerically identical. Or, trying to think of another example. Right. Well, think of like a coffee mug like this, right? This coffee mug comes from, I don't know where it comes from actually. I think from one of Galen Weston's evil grocery stores. Anyway, my partner got it for me. It's got the letter J for Josh. But there are dozens of these at the store, all right? They're all qualitatively identical. But only this one is numerically identical with this one. This cup is this cup. We're interested in numerical identity here. Am I identical, say it time two on Mars, with myself at time one on Earth before I take the transporter? Parfit says, if I was teletransported, my replica on Mars would be qualitatively identical to me, but on the skeptic's view, he wouldn't be me. He wouldn't be numerically identical with me. I shall have ceased to exist. And that, we naturally assume, is what matters. But it's not. It's not important. I mean, it's not important, but in this case, that is not what matters. Some of the other questions around sameness of identity that we can ask of persons over time, we could ask for a criterion, some criterion of identity, which tells us what the relation is between a person at time A and time B, tells us what that relation is. We've seen a number of these criteria before. Uh, Bodily continuity could be one. So, you've got um, your animalists and your constitutionalists, right? If you think back to Kassam's chapter, if I'm an animalist, I believe that a person is the entire human creature. So, um, if I destroy that creature and then replicate it, I suppose, yeah, you could deny that I am numerically identical with the first creature, even though I might be qualitatively identical. Or if you put your brain in a vat, right? I think the animalists and constitutionalists might say that, oh, well, now you're not you anymore because the body's been destroyed. And then psychological continuity is another one, right? So, think of Locke, the memory criterion. Yeah, I guess, yeah, if we're talking about the subjective experience of being teletransported, would be like sleep or suspended animation or maybe like anesthesia. So, in terms of psychological continuity, I mean, well, again, like keep in mind, and I'm in agreement with Parfit here. Yeah, whether I'm made out of the exact same matter, whether I'm a replica, these things don't matter, right? Because if I don't want to get ahead of myself, but if I take the transporter to Mars and I get there successfully, like there's somebody there who's psychologically continuous with me on Earth in the right ways and who's physically indistinguishable. So someone exists. And it's no different than, I don't know, when we blink, when we seem to blink out of existence every night when we go to sleep, right? So, um, so whatever, oh my goodness, whatever, criterion we use to spell out the relation between a person at two different times, whether it's, bodily continuity or psychological continuity. When we apply these criteria to what Parfit is calling physical spectrum cases, we think that there must be an answer um, to whether or not you are identical with the person that you were previously. Parfit writes that if this is how we think about such cases, we assume that our identity must be determinate. We assume that in every imaginable case, questions about our identity must have answers, which must be either and quite simply yes or no. But is that the case? Is personal identity really determinate? Are there really such answers? Um, it's possible on some views, sure. Maybe if you're a dualist, there are definite answers. You take the transporter. As long as your replica has your soul, your thinking substance, then what's the worry? You're you. But Uh, there aren't really any good reasons to be Cartesian dualists. In fact, there are quite a few good reasons not to be Cartesian dualists. Parfit proceeds as if dualism is just not going to work. Um, and it's not. So instead of pursuing a dualist view, we'll pursue some kind of reductionist view. On the reductionist view, the claim is that one, and this is claim number one, a person's existence just consists in the existence of a body and the occurrence of a theory of a series of thoughts, experiences, and other mental and physical events. But there are certain kinds of reductionists, right? There are identifying reductionists who claim that persons are bodies. So again, think of your animalists. People are entire human creatures. That's what it is to be a person. So you're identified with your body. I mean, think of the mind-brain identity theory. What does it do? It identifies mental states as brain states. We're doing something similar here. What is a person? A person is the body. But that's too simple. So he combines number two with number one and gets the following, number three. A person is an entity that has a body and has thoughts and other experiences. Now, Parfit calls this constitutive reductionism, because personal identity on this view consists in having a body with thoughts and experiences, even though the person is distinct from their body. And you might remember here constitutionalism. So, constitutionalism, recall, is the idea that we are constituted by, but not identical with, the material of the body. Um, Michelangelo's David, I think was the example I used, is constituted by the marble, but not identical with the marble. Parfit uses the example of a bronze statue. So say you've got a bronze bust of like Zeus or something, right? You melt it down. Now you just have a lump of bronze. That's what the statue was made of. So the statue was constituted by the bronze, but it's not identical with the bronze. Would constitutive reductionism be a combination of one and two? Yes, yes, that's exactly right. See, or one and three. I may have made a mistake here. A combination of one and two. Or no, it is a combination of one and three. So we're not just bodies. So it's not a combination of one and two, it's a combination of one and three. Because on two we are just bodies. But on three, on one and three, we have these a series of psychological states, thoughts, experiences, other mental events. So we have a body and thoughts and other experiences. So think of it as one and three rather than one and two. That's what I would do. Another kind of reductionism is eliminative reductionism. This is an argument offered against identifying reductionism as uh, it's kind of like, think of the identity theory and eliminative reductionism about the mental. One says so identity theory says that mental states are just brain states. Don't worry about whether we're talking like token identity theory, type identity theory, doesn't matter. The point is, mental states are identical with brain states. Eliminative reductionism goes a step further and says, well, let's just dispense with the mental talk then, and we'll reduce the mental to the physical. So here, eliminative reductionism, unlike identifying reductionism, says um, we're not just reducing in terms of identifying persons with bodies, we're eliminating um, these higher level descriptions. So Parfit says there aren't really such things as persons on this view. There are only brains and bodies and thoughts and other experiences. So this is a bit like the Buddhist version of the self. Um, so from the Vasu Bandhu, we have Buddha has spoken thus. O brethren, there are actions and also their consequences, but there is no person who acts. There exists no individual. It is only a conventional name given to a set of elements. So, this is an example of what Parfit has come to call bundle theory, or a particular flavor of bundle theory, where there aren't really persons, um, just thoughts, perceptions, impressions. It's named um, after how Hume described the person, David Hume, who says that when he enters into himself, he only perceives this bundle, of thoughts and perceptions, but but never a person, never a self. So it's named following Hume. But the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, probably has the claim to being the first bundle theorist. Now, sometimes eliminative reductionism is appropriate. I like the little remark he makes about witches. So, eliminative reductionism. There were no witches, there were only persecuted women. It means, like, yeah, there aren't really witches going around flying on broomsticks and casting spells. But there were women who were accused of witchcraft and persecuted on that basis, right? So it's like we eliminate talk of witches and just reduce everything down to talk of persecuted women, right? But often eliminative reductionism isn't helpful. What we should maybe do instead is make the appropriate distinctions between kinds of existence, right? So if an X consists in a Y or Ys, for example, then even if X is distinct from Y, X is not a separately or independently existing thing. Um, so again, think of the statue, right? If Michelangelo's David consists in the marble, then even if it's distinct from the marble, it's not a separately or independently existing thing from the marble, right? Like Michelangelo's David is not a independently existing thing from the marble it's made of. And that's where we get claim number five. Persons are distinct from their bodies and from any series of mental events, but they are not independent or separately existing entities. If we were Cartesians about the self, then selves would be separate, independently existing things, right? The self would be a substance, a thinking substance specifically. But on reductionism, reductionism doesn't view persons like this. They aren't independent from their bodies in this way. Okay, I think we should probably leave it there because we've only got 2 minutes left according to my clock. Any questions, real quick, before we go? Oh, all right. Well, um, yeah, I suppose that's it. If there are no well, email me if you have questions. Um, I suppose I might get some questions. After all, after this is uploaded, I hope people watch the recording. If you've missed it, if you missed today, um, and if you have to go anywhere today, do be careful. I see that the freezing rain has started. I noticed that they have preemptively salted, at least on my street. I don't know if they've done that where you are. Um, but it can still, if it gets real cold, it could still get quite treacherous out there. So, if you're driving, if you're walking around, in whatever way you're out and about, um, be careful. Take care of yourselves. Um, and I'll see you all in class on Friday. And we're going to try and get through the rest of this. This is quite a long set of slides, but again, because Parfit is so punchy, I think we might actually be able to get through it. Um, so I'll see you on Friday. We'll pick up from slide 8 here and continue talking about the unimportance of identity. All right. Well, thanks everybody who joined us today. I'm glad that some people showed up. Actually, the attendance is pretty good. It's no worse than uh, in class. And you know what? This has been kind of fun. I missed giving the online lecture, so I like the online lecture. It's fun. It's fun doing it this way. So thanks everyone. See you on Friday. Stay warm, stay safe, um, and see you soon.
Bye.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Bye. Yeah, and yeah, glad you got to meet Yo-Yo. So, lovely. All right. Great job. Take care, everyone.